In this news roundup of the week for Friday the 16th of February 2024, everyone is worrying about Russian nuclear weapons in space and if they were used against, Moldova, say, whether Donald Trump's America would help to defend them. Meanwhile, in the world of things that are actually happening, the new climate fund that's supposed to channel money from wealthy countries to poorer ones is in disarray as countries bicker about who's in charge. The EU has put its water resilience plan on hold, even as Spain and Italy are facing yet more drought. And, breaking as this video is about to be shot, the unsurprising but shocking nonetheless news that Alexy Navalny has died in prison. Firstly, I have to ask the question, is it just me, or is half the news this week about arguably hysterical reactions to non-news? Of course, the thing about hysterical overreactions is that they can end up becoming news themselves or even become self-fulfilling prophecies. Any government figure who ever told the public that there was no reason to go out panic buying will be able to attest to that. This week, it seems not once but twice, the assembled political classes, the journalists and all those who orbit around them took stories that could have been shrugged off and turned them into real-life things. So, first case in point, Donald Trump, while making his usual energetic and sometimes relatively random campaign speeches, made comments that are entirely in keeping with his style, where he boasted about pushing NATO members into upping how much they were spending on defence. And it was like we were right back in the days of the Trump presidency again. Because if you recall, during the Trump presidency, he would say stuff, choosing words apparently almost at random, always boastful, often not particularly well judged. People would then go out of their way to read those words literally, and if there was any ambiguity, which was like always, they would take the very worst interpretation that they could, and then they would lose their minds about it. And various people would come to believe that Trump had actually said things that really he clearly didn't or didn't intend to. Did Trump really say or mean to say that neo-Nazis were fine people? No, he didn't. Did Trump really tell people to inject bleach to defend themselves against COVID? Again, no, not really. Did he say a bunch of random stuff that left people scratching their heads? And you would kind of hope that a president of the United States would have spoken more effectively? Well, yeah, pretty much always. And that was especially a problem during times of crisis, for sure. Whatever you do or don't think about the job that Barack Obama did as president, he was the last one who you could at least say spoke coherently and in complete sentences. Anyway, this time, Trump was boasting about pushing the weak NATO countries around to his base. And he did what he does most often. He exaggerates for effect. Did a NATO leader really, literally say to Trump, "Well, sir," no, not even that bit, because that's not how they talk. "Well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us?" No NATO leader literally said those words. And of course, Trump, who nevertheless was very robust at the time and threatened to pull out of NATO if changes weren't forthcoming, but he also didn't literally say in response, "No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them," by which he meant Russia, "to do whatever the hell they want. You gotta pay." Having not been in the game much since Trump was removed from office, we were now right back in the game, where commentators all took this seriously and responded as though it was a considered foreign policy statement. It would have been easy to say, "This is Trump. This is kind of how he talks. He was actually telling a story about during his time as president, and the US did not leave NATO while he was president. NATO members are increasing the amounts they spend on their own defence, with a record 18 countries on course to hit the 2% target in 2024. So no one need worry, and indeed it's hard to avoid the conclusion that he succeeded in pushing them to do more. Although, let's be clear, the Ukraine war hasn't exactly put them off the idea. Now, of course, there's a reason for that not having been the response. Don't know if I've ever mentioned it, but, there's an election on. So all of those outraged politicians and all of those commentators have an interest in people believing that Trump was speaking literally, because they hope that that will make them want to turn back to, sleepy old Joe Biden, who, although he may forget a name or two occasionally, at least he's not going to blow up the Western alliance. But the price of doing that is to reinforce the message. Democrats and journalists alike have been saying Trump clearly means every word of this. He is literally encouraging Russia to invade NATO members, and that means that Trump cannot be trusted as president, therefore vote for Biden, blah, blah, blah. Which is all very well, but polls are showing right now Trump is more likely than Biden to be the next president, and there's no sign that Trump's rhetoric towards NATO is an issue that would swing American voters in any way. What it does do is to put the world spotlight onto whether a Trump America would actually be a reliable or robust ally in the face of aggressive expansionist powers. Now, if such powers believe that Trump would enfeeble America, as they suggest, it does indeed make it more likely they would test out the waters should those circumstances come to pass. So by treating it seriously, you arguably make it more serious in terms of the negative impacts it might actually have on America's position in the world. A self-fulfilling prophecy, in other words. Now, it may also have positive impacts. European countries right now are certainly taking a second Trump term seriously and reflecting that this may mean that America completely withdraws from its world leadership position. So they need to plan now to be in a position to be much more self-reliant in terms of their own defence, also their economic activities, climate policies and all the rest, and that may be no bad thing. For example, this week European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called on the EU to subsidise defence production. The EU needed to incentivise Europe's defence industry to ramp up production and promote consolidation, she said. A plan is to be produced this month, showing how the bloc will be achieving those goals, although you can expect individual EU states to probably be pushing back against any attempts to centralise decision-making on defence investments. They at least are doing what Donald Trump would like the American people to do, to look beyond the sale, to plan now for the reality of President Trump 2.0. So that's one apparently unnecessary panic this week. Then we had a ripple of fear that went across the world that Russia is on the verge of putting nuclear weapons in space. This began when the chair of the US House Intelligence Committee, Mike Turner, sent a somewhat cryptic request to President Biden asking him to declassify information regarding a serious national security threat. That's the sort of thing that attracts attention. An unspoken threat known to intelligence but not revealed to the public? Yeah, you're going to want to know about that. The puzzle was revealed when ABC News reported this was probably referring to a Russian scheme to use nuclear weapons in space as anti-satellite weapons. Some members of Turner's own GOP caucus responded negatively to all this, suggesting that it was a stunt to whip up fear about Russia, perfectly timed to support the passage of a bill authorising more aid to Ukraine. Others said that it wasn't that big a deal, that it referred to reports the Intelligence Committee routinely saw a couple of times a month, and that it was a real danger that was on the horizon for the medium to long term, but nothing to press the panic button about right now. Various people were panicked nonetheless, at least if the quantity of chatter about the subject in the public press is anything to go by. And look, it would be a serious cause for concern, and it is entirely credible that Russia would be working on this for the medium term. We know that Russia, and China as well of course, have shown a lot of interest in building the capability to destroy enemy satellites in space. The thing is, it's quite a hard thing to do, space being, big, and satellites being rather small as well as plentiful. So firing a nuclear weapon in a satellite's general vicinity If it was your aim to degrade the entire satellite network rather than just one individual satellite, it's a lot easier and it would be highly effective. Arguably, however, it would also be a major escalation on the path to potential all-out war. I mean, so much of modern infrastructure now depends on the workings of the many and various satellites. It would be a massive, aggressive economic blow to the US particularly, but to the entire world. And since it would have the effect of blinding American defense communications networks, any American president is going to be presented with the strong likelihood that it's the prelude to a nuclear first strike on the United States. Certainly during the Cold War, both Western and Soviet planners presumed that high-altitude nuclear detonations would be the first move in such a strike. So yes, the idea of putting nuclear weapons in space would be highly provocative. Also against an existing treaty, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. But unfortunately, the modern trend seems to be disregarding burdensome treaties on a whim, so that in itself is unlikely to be a barrier. As we sit here today, no such system has been deployed. Given that Russia's focus is on rather more immediate matters, it's not likely to appear in the short term either. So why the panic? Well, maybe it really was about trying to gain support for a Ukrainian funding bill, because it's hard to see any other reason why it should suddenly burst into the scope of everyone's attention right now. So that's all the news about things that people didn't really say and the things that aren't really happening. While everyone's been talking about those, you might well ask, well, what's been actually going on in the real world? Usually a safe guess for that question would be chaos and incompetence, and you could make that case this week. So one of the big headlines from the last two COP climate change conferences was the setting up of a fund that would help poorer countries to adapt their infrastructure to the impacts of climate change and to recover when hit by large-scale climate disasters such as floods and droughts. Since the need is considered to be urgent, you'd expect that would all be set up and operational by now, yeah? Yeah, not so much. A functioning fund is being delayed, we discovered this week, because of a massive punch-up between rich countries over who gets to sit on the board. In particular, the United States and the European Union are disagreeing over whether the fund's biggest donors so far should get extra seats on the board, deciding on how that cash should be distributed. Add to that disagreements over Ukraine and internal disagreements within the EU itself and the demands for special treatment from Turkey, then nothing much is getting done. The original agreement was that membership of the board would, not unreasonably, be split half and half between the developing countries, some of whom would be recipients of support, and the developed countries, who would be the contributors. One problem is that the United States, of course, as the premier world power, expects to be seated at that table. But in terms of the amount that it's actually donated to the fund, it's not very high, only ranks 11th. France, Italy, Germany, United Arab Emirates, the UK have all paid more than double, and mostly a lot more than double of what the US has done. The US State Department said that the idea that seats should be allocated on fund pledges to be, quote, kind of odd. It's not wholly obvious how that argument goes. It's also suggested that even though a country hasn't pledged a lot yet, doesn't mean that they never would, which also probably isn't the strongest argument in the room. It's not helped that Russia and Belarus are vetoing any Eastern EU countries from nominating anyone to sit on the bloc reserved for that group, where they can exercise that veto. And Turkey, which is listed as an industrialised country, so a should-be donor, insists that it is instead a developing country, so a would-be recipient. It is arguing that it should therefore be able to take one of the developing countries' seats. If you think all of that sounds like a prescription for nothing much happening anytime soon, I would be hard-pushed to disagree. Also, not happening soon, reportedly this week, is the EU's water resilience plan, the latest in a series of U-turns on climate-related policy. Unlike recent measures on farming, which have been fiercely criticised by protesting farmers, it's not really obvious why this policy has been dropped or pushed back. The policy was originally announced by Ursula von der Leyen in September last year, but it disappeared this week from the EU executive's latest calendar of actions. It was previously supposed to be launched on March the 12th. I say this one is more surprising. The delay or cancellation comes as large parts of southern Europe are already facing up to what seems to be emerging as a third year in a row of severe drought. Catalonia declared a drought emergency earlier this month. Sicily said it was in a state of natural disaster last week. Spain and Italy are broadly facing real problems. And obviously this is February. You know, it's supposed to be cold and wet right now, or cooler and wet. Drought at this point, added to the 2 years of previous problems in that region, makes it look extremely tricky. Indeed, according to the European Drought Observatory, as much as 17% of EU territory is facing drought conditions. The disappeared programme was also supposed to address how to handle the flip side, for example, the dramatic flooding in Greece last year. And it's weird because if you're worried about what affects farmers, for instance, you'd think this was the one policy you would want in place, helping them to cope with droughts and floods, since it's agriculture that is predominantly impacted by both. And finally, a story that might have been inevitable, except other leaders have emerged from similar situations in the past against all the apparent odds. But Russian opposition leader and constant Putin critic from behind bars, Alexy Navalny, is being reported as having died in prison. In some ways it's been astonishing that he survived so long. In 2020, the Russian state, remember, tried to poison him with the nerve agent Novichok, and very nearly succeeded, except he was whisked to a German hospital where his life was saved. The open-source intelligence group Bellingcat went on to identify, along with CNN, the Russian agents who had been involved in that attack, and they actually filmed Navalny calling them up, getting one of them to confess, unaware of who he was speaking to. And then, knowing that it was highly likely to go badly for him, Navalny decided to return to Russia to continue his work there if he could, or to end up in jail if he had to. Any doubt on that score was dispelled when he was met at the airport that his flight was diverted to. Right now, my expectation is that approximately nobody will believe that his death in custody wasn't the will of the Kremlin. I mean, it's not like they've earned any benefit of the doubt on this matter. He'd relatively recently been transferred to a penal colony north of the Arctic Circle, one known for its extremely harsh conditions and, of course, its isolation. And with the forthcoming Russian election, where Putin's opponents have either been struck from the ballot or imprisoned or murdered, it's not as though the timing isn't exactly what you might have expected. The dream that some had, that one day Navalny would triumph as Nelson Mandela had triumphed, and he would emerge from prison to lead his people. To be fair, that was always an unlikely outcome. His support amongst the population wasn't in line with it, but he had been a high-profile thorn in Putin's side, exposing corruption in the Kremlin, pointing at Putin's own wealth and his hidden palace, and orchestrating some of the biggest protests seen in Russia in the modern era. That Putin felt the need to finally remove him speaks of his weakness, not of his strength. How the next part of Russian history plays out isn't entirely obvious, but there is no doubt that Navalny will be someone remembered for the difference that he made, for the integrity and the courage that he showed when it mattered. People will say that he made a misjudgment in going back to Russia, but we know that he did so, knowing full well the risk that came with it, and he did so in the belief that the push for more political accountability wouldn't die if he did. Whether that will be proven to be true or mistaken, very much down now to the others who follow him.